Hello and welcome. My name is Ian McGlasham and today we're going to be taking a look at creating this effect using an amazing script created by a friend of mine, Simo Money. You can download the script by clicking the link in the description below this video. First of all, start Blender. If you don't already have it, then head over to blender.org to download the latest version. Once you have started Blender, click anywhere outside the splash screen to get rid of it. Hit Alt and F11 to expand to full screen and we are ready to go. The first thing to do is to save a blend file, so I'll go to File, Save As, and find the cloth cubes folder you created earlier. Press the plus add button to add a bookmark for this folder, just so we can get to it easily when we create this scene. Now type a name for the blend file, let's just call it Cube A. Hit enter and press Save Blender File. Good. Now let's quickly change a few settings in the Properties panel. Let's set the end frame to 400 and change the frames per second to 25. Move the mouse pointer into the timeline and hit Home to show the full range from 1 to 400. We can use the default cube, so select it, rename it Cube A, press Tab in the 3D view to enter edit mode. We need to subdivide it a little so the cloth simulator has some geometry to work with, so press W to bring up the specials menu, select subdivide, and then over here on the left increase the number of cuts to 7. Tab out of edit mode and change the shading to smooth in the tool shelf. If you can't see the tool shelf, hitting T toggles it on and off. Now, ready to make this cube a cloth object, which we do by finding the physics tab. If you can't see it, just drag this window out a little and it's the one on the end. Now click cloth and we can set up some properties for our cube. What we want is to create a very stiff material so the cube holds its shape on impact. I won't go into too much detail here. After some experimentation with the cloth simulator, I know which settings are going to give us a good result for this, and I would encourage you to experiment in the same way. In the meantime, set the quality to 50, set the mass to 6, structural to 200, bending to 500, and in the damping section change the spring to 50 and the air to 0.1, which just allows the cloth to gather speed a little while it falls. Now click the Cloth Collisions tab and let's change the friction to 50 to stop the cube from sliding around too much. Check the Self Collisions box and increase the quality to 10 and the distance to 1. This helps the cube spring back to its initial shape when it gets very squashed. You can leave the other properties at their default values and we can move on to the cloth cache. We need to tell Blender to store the calculated simulation on disk, so let's give the simulation a name, just call it Cube Sim. Increase the end frame to 400 to match our sequence settings and click the disk cache checkbox. The cube's now set up, but we need to move it up in world space and make a floor for it to fall onto. So in the 3D view, hit G, Z, 40 and hit enter to move it up. You can press home to view the entire scene. Then pressing Shift C to make sure the 3D cursor is centered. Add a floor plane by pressing Shift A to bring up the add menu and selecting Mesh Plane. Now scale the plane up by 50 units, so hit S, type 50 and hit enter. Over in the physics panel, press collision to make the plane an obstacle and leave everything else at its default value. Selecting the cube again, move to the very start of the sequence and hit play. This begins the simulation, displaying it live so you can see what's happening. This will take 3 or 4 minutes, so I'll pause it and come back when it's almost finished. So, once the simulation is complete, it'll continue looping, and when you've had a look at it and decided everything works, press pause and select this button, Current Cache to Bake, in the cloth panel to finalize the animation. We can now export the cube by animating to a sequence of OBJ files on disk by selecting File, Export, Wavefront.obj. There are a few settings to change here. We want selection only, so that only our cube is considered. We want animation, so that it creates one file per frame of animation. And we need to remove the tick for write materials. We're going to create materials later on, and the extra clutter would be annoying at this stage. So let's create a folder to store them in. Press I to create a new folder and call it Cube A Objects. Click this new folder to move inside it and enter Cube A as the file name. Hit enter. Press the Export OBJ button. It won't take long, and after a few seconds we're back in Blender. One animation's all good and well, but to make things look a little more chaotic in the final design, it would be fun to have another one. So we can save a copy of this file, go to File and Save As, click our bookmark to get us back to our working folder, and save it as Cube B. Back in Blender, let's rename Cube A to Cube B. Now we can add an obstacle to this scene and rerun the simulation to create a new animation. So firstly, we want to press Free Bake in the cloth settings to clear the animation from earlier. Now let's add something for the cube to bounce off so that it tumbles across the floor a little. Again, press Shift and C just to make sure the 3D cursor is in the center of the scene. Press Alt A, Mesh and Cube to add a cube. Let's move this cube up a little, say 15 units, so press G, Z, 15. And move it to the side a little by pressing G, X, minus 1.8. Over in the physics panel, press Collision. If you don't like the resulting animation, you can move this cube around a little or rotate it until you get an animation you like. But for now, this should be fine. Move to the end of the timeline and press play. The animation loops, and when it gets to the start of the sequence, it will start simulating if there is no simulation there already. I'll leave that running and pause for a few minutes while it thinks about it. Back soon. Again, the animation keeps looping when it's complete, so you can see the sequence. If you don't like what you see, you can always hit Free Bake, move the obstacle cube around a little, and simulate it again. But I think this looks good, so I'll just pause the playback, hit Current Cached Bake, and let's export this animation as another sequence of OBJ files. So, go to File, Export, Wavefront OBJ, press I to create a new folder for them, call it Cube B Objects, click the folder and enter a name for the sequence, call it Cube B, press Export OBJ, and after a few seconds we are done creating our initial animations. So save the file, File, Save As, and we can now start a brand new blend file to create our final design. So either quit Blender and restart it, or just press Ctrl and N to reload the empty startup file. Let's save this file, so File, Save As, and in our working folder create a new name called, say, Cubes Design, and hit Save Blender File. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is run the amazing script created by See More Money, which will add a new option to the file menu, which we'll use a little later. Change the layout to scripting using this drop-down menu here, and in this text editor on the left of the screen, select Text, open text block, and find the script you downloaded earlier. I put it in our working directory, so I can just click the bookmark, select the script, and hit Open Text Block. As you can see, the script is loaded, and all you need to do is run it by hitting this button. It doesn't seem to have done much, but if you open the File menu and go to Import, you will see a new entry called OBJ as Shape Key. Don't click it for now, we'll be using it later. Just change the layout back to the default screen and we are ready to go. So let's change a few settings as we did for our other files. We want our sequence to be 400 frames. We want to run at 25 frames per second. Let's move the mouse pointer into the timeline, hit Home to show the entire range. We can delete the default cube and lamp just by selecting them, hitting X and clicking Delete. Let's do that for both. Now let's import our animations. We only need to import the first object in each sequence, as See More Money's script will deal with the rest of the animation once we have these objects set up as containers of a sort for the animation. So go to File, Import, Wavefront.obj, click on the Cube A directory, select the first file in the list and hit Import. Now, to set up this object, we need to go to the Object Data tab and press the plus button in the Shape Key section to add what Blender calls a basis key. This will be the initial shape for the animation. Then there's this checkbox here, Relative, which we need to uncheck, and this allows us to create a timing curve for the animation, which Blender calls evaluation time. It's not automatic at the moment, you do have to set a few keyframes first, so let's do that now. First, change this drop-down box to linear, then move to frame 0 on the timeline and set the first keyframe for evaluation time. What we are telling Blender is that frame 0 is the start of the animation. Now let's move to the end of our sequence, frame 400, and let's enter 4000 as the evaluation time. Blender counts up in tens for this purpose, so however long your sequence of OBJ files needs to be multiplied by 10 for this to work correctly. Now, one last thing to do for this to work properly, we need to make the evaluation curve linear, which we can do very quickly by changing the main window to a graph editor, hit home to view the curve, and press T and select linear from this little pop-up menu. That is now set up, ready for us to run the script, so let's change back to the 3D view and do just that. From the File menu, select Import, and then we can choose our new option, OBJ as Shape Key, which takes us to the usual file browser. Now we are already in the correct folder with our animation, so just hit A to select all of the files. One important thing to remember here is that we already have the first frame of the animation imported, so we can shift-click the first file and remove it from our selection. Now just hit Import Objects as Shape Keys, and after a few seconds we will return to Blender, and you can see when we scrub through the timeline that this object now animates. But unlike having it controlled by Blender's cloth simulation, we can move it, rotate it, scale it, duplicate it, add modifiers to it, perform any operation that we can apply to any normal Blender object. If we were to render it using Blender Internal with motion blur, everything would work correctly. One additional step we can do at this stage is to put the origin of the object in a more useful position, which for our needs would be in the center of the object when it's in its final position. To do that, we need to scroll down the list of shape keys and highlight the last one. This just tells Blender which frame to use in edit mode, which we will now tab into in the 3D view to see the mesh. All of the vertices are already selected, so we can just select Mesh, Snap, Cursor to Selected, which places the 3D cursor at the center of the mesh. Now tab out of edit mode, and we can select Object, Transform, Center to 3D Cursor. Now, when we scale and rotate the object, it all happens around this point, which we will find very useful when creating our final design. Let's rename this to Cube A and follow exactly the same procedure for Cube B, so that we got two animations to play with. So, go to File, Import, Wavefront OBJ, click our bookmark, and now click the Cube B Objects directory. Again, select the first file in the list and hit Import. Now, to set up this object, we need to go to the Object Data tab again and press the plus button in the Shape Key section to add the basis key for it. Now, uncheck the Relative checkbox and in the drop-down menu choose Linear. And move to frame 0 as before on the timeline and set the first keyframe for evaluation time. Then move to the end of the sequence, frame 400, and again enter 4000 as the evaluation time. Once again, we need to make this curve linear, so change the main window to a graph editor, hit Home to view the curve, press T and select Linear. Now this cube is ready for the script, so change back to the 3D view and let's do that. From the File menu, again, select Import and choose our new option, OBJ as Shape Key, which takes us to the usual file browser. It hasn't defaulted to the Cube B directory, so I'm going to hit our bookmark and click the Cube B Objects folder. Now hit A to select all the files, shift-click the first file to deselect it, and just hit Import Objects as Shape Keys. After a few seconds we'll return to Blender and you can see that when we scrub through the timeline that this object now animates. Again, let's put the origin of this cube in a more useful position. So, scroll down the list of shape keys, highlight the last one, tab into edit mode. Again, all the vertices are all selected, so select Mesh, Snap, Cursor to Selected, which places the 3D cursor at the center of the mesh. Now tab out of edit mode and we can select Object, Transform, Center to 3D Cursor. Rename this to Cube B and we are ready to create a design. First off, let's make these cubes look a little better by adding a subdivision surface to both of them. So select Cube A, go to the Modifiers panel and select Subdivision Surface. Just leave the default values as they are and do the same for Cube B. Let's save the file. Now, I would normally change Blender's default layout a little while working, so I'm going to do that first. You don't have to do this, but you will find yourself changing between views quite a lot, which slows down the flow of working a little. So first of all, I want to split this main 3D view into two by dragging this right across, and in the new left-hand window, I'll change this to an outliner. Then I'll split this view again from the bottom and change this new view to a graph editor. And then one last time split this window and change the bottom version to a dope sheet. Okay, just tidy those windows up a little, and we are ready to go back to the 3D view and split it downwards. And then the lower window, split this vertically. So on the top 3D view, I'd like to show the camera, so I'd press 0 and then I'd press N and T until both the tool shelf and the properties panel were displayed. That's where I would normally keep those. Tidy that up. And in the bottom left hand window, I'd get rid of the tool shelf by pressing T, and I want to change it to a front orthographic and wireframe projection by pressing 1, 5 and Z. Get rid of the tool shelf over here and change it to a top orthographic projection by pressing 7, 5 and Z. Again, just tidy the windows up and move this out a little so I can see all of the buttons. And I want to get rid of this outliner, which I'll do by dragging upwards until this arrow appears, and on releasing it, it disappears. So let's add a floor plane so it looks like the cubes are actually landing on something. I'll press Shift and C to reset the 3D cursor, and then press Shift A to bring up the Add menu and select Mesh and Plane. Scale it up, say 50 units for this tutorial, and that's fine. Rename the plane to Floor. Now, with Cube A selected, we can move it to the center of the screen by zeroing its values for X and Y position in the Properties panel in the top 3D window. Now, in the top view, zoom in by hitting Del on the numeric keypad and rotate it until it's perpendicular to the grid. Once you're happy that it's straight, you can choose Object, Apply, Rotation, and that's the cube positioned. Now, select Cube B and zero its coordinates again for X and Y position. Rotate it so it's more or less straight. Choose Object, Apply, Rotation, and then let's move it 3 units to the left by hitting GX minus 3. And now we can scrub through our timeline and see that we have the start of our design. So let's duplicate Cube B and move it to the other side of our first cube, so press X6 and hit Enter. If we scroll through the animation, we can see that this looks, and in fact is, too similar to the cube on the left. We can fix this by rotating it and offsetting the animation. So let's try RZ minus 90. And now the object rotates in from here, avoiding the other cubes. Because it happens at the same time as the cube on the left, we can offset the timing of the animation simply by moving its animation curve. So move the mouse pointer into the graph editor, which will be displaying its evaluation curve, and just hit GX minus 60. And we already have an interesting animation which ends up with 3 cubes in an arrangement of our choice. We could go on making tens or even hundreds of cubes to create any design we want, but for this process let's just add a few more cubes to make a 3x3 grid. So let's duplicate by pressing Shift and D the center cube and move it minus 3 in X, so GX minus 3 and Enter, and move it up in Y. Rotate this one 180 degrees, and let's offset its animation curve just so that it doesn't intersect any cubes now or later. So I'll move the mouse pointer into the graph editor and just move it along 120 frames by hitting GX 120. The animation for your cubes is likely to be a little different from mine, so you'll very simply need to experiment with timings until you get something that works. Keep adding cubes in any arrangement you want until you have a 3x3 grid with none of the animations intersecting each other. I'm going to finish adding a few cubes now, and then we can move on adding some simple materials and rendering. I'll duplicate our original cube B and move it into position here. Offset its animation again by moving into the graph editor and pressing GX minus 40. If I scrub through the timeline, I can see it's all looking random. Good. Now I'll duplicate cube A again and move it to the top corner by hitting GX3 enter and GY3 enter, and offset its timings. GX90 enter. Last row, I'll duplicate cube A again and hit GX minus 3 and hit GY minus 3 enter, RZ minus 90 and offset its timing in the graph editor GX15. Now duplicate cube B and hit GX3, enter, GY-3, enter, rotate it, RZ 180, and offset the timings of it in the graph editor GX20. Finally, duplicate cube A again and move it 3 across, GX3, enter, and down, GY-3, enter, rotate it, GZ90, and offset the animation GX35. Now we have a full animation ready to apply some simple materials and a camera move and render it out. So let's save the file. Because I've used Cycles for this project, we should change the render engine to Cycles Render from the drop-down menu at the top of the screen. If you have a CUDA enabled card, you can enable it for rendering by selecting File, User Preferences, and then selecting the System tab and selecting CUDA as the rendering option. Now back over in the render settings, change the device to GPU compute in the drop down menu, and in sampling I would normally increase the preview samples to somewhere between 10 and 50. It depends very much on your computer and graphics card. This value can be higher or lower depending on how responsive the system feels as you're making changes. Now in the top 3D view window, which displays what the camera sees, I'd like to set the viewport shading to rendered, which makes this window show output from Cycles. Now we can't see much, so let's add some light to the scene using an HDRI file. I've used a file called Beach Probe, which you can download from the link below this video, but you can use any HDRI file you want. Now go to the World Settings tab from the Main Properties panel. If you click Use Nodes and then click the small dot next to the color, and from that list select Environment Texture. Click Open and navigate to your HDR file wherever it is, select it and open it. The HDR file I'm using has a mirror ball projection. You should check whether yours has mirror ball or equirectangular projection. Whoever created it will have left that information hanging around somewhere. Now I would normally change the vector to mapping, which gives us a little extra control of the direction of the lights in the image. In the new options which have appeared, select the vector drop-down menu and choose Texture Coordinate Generated. Now, when we start rendering some tests, we can easily rotate the map around its Z-axis to change the position and feel of the lighting. Let's leave it at 0 for now. Select the floor and choose the Materials tab from the Main Properties panel. Click the New button and in the Material name box type Floor Mat. Let's make the floor a glossy material by selecting Glossy from the Surface drop-down menu and change the roughness to 0.8. This just adds a tiny little bit of reflection to it, which I think looks nice. Now select this front central cube. You can select it in the Cycles window, but it doesn't give you any indication that it's selected. So in this top view, I'm just going to move back a little so we can see all the cubes, and there we see it highlighted in orange. So we can add a new material for it. Let's call it Gold Matte. And then in the Surface menu, select again Glossy. We want it to be a perfect mirror effectively, but a gold one, so let's make it a golden color. And something like that will be fine. Now we select the other cubes and just apply this material to them through the drop down box. So now we can see we've very quickly made these 3 gold. We can select one of the other cubes. This one here is fine. And let's add a new material for this. So this one we'll call Watery Matte. We'll change it to a glass shader. And change the index of refraction to 1.31, which I believe is the index of refraction for water. I may be wrong. We can select other cubes and apply that material to them. So we're just making this diagonal pattern. So let's select these 4 cubes here and apply it to all of them, and that's good enough for now. Then let's select these N2 cubes and give them something different, so let's add a new material and call it Purple Matte. In the Surface shader, again we'll choose Glossy, but this time we'll make the color purple. You could have guessed. And that looks okay. So we'll select the one at the other side and just apply the Purple Matte to that. And now we have a nice arrangement of cubes. If we scrub through in cycles, we can kind of get an impression of how it's going to look. So I think that looks nice, but for the animation it would be interesting if we had a more interesting camera setup. So we'll add some depth of field and some motion to the camera before we go on. So first of all, let's select the camera, and in its properties, let's change the angle. I like to widen the angle of a camera lens a little. It just makes the whole motion and the design look a little more dramatic. So around 27. But you can experiment with whatever you think looks nice. That's artistic preference. Now again, over in the front view, I'll press Shift-C, and we can add an empty which the camera will look at. So just add plane axis empty and change its name. Call it camera interest. And then if we select the camera and then shift select the camera interest, down in this view press Control and T and then track to constraint. Now when we select just this interest and move it around, we'll see that the camera kind of follows it and always keeps it in the center of the screen. Now if we move this interest to, it doesn't really matter where, just so that the view looks nice. This is going to be kind of our end frame. So let's just move our camera around a little until I find something I like. I don't want to fiddle with this for too long, so let's just call that fine, and it is. And let's go around to just before the cubes are finished settling. That's when the camera is going to settle, and we'll set a keyframe by pressing I and location. And now let's go to the very first frame of the animation and just move the camera somewhere else, just so that it there is a small amount of camera motion. I location sets a keyframe for that. So we're not going to animate the interest at this point. I normally would, but there's really no need. Particularly if there was a texture on the floor, which we haven't put on this, then maybe we'd animate the interest. But for now, that's fine. So now we want to add a little depth of field, so let's add an empty, another plane axis empty, and rename it camera focus. And that's going to help us to define exactly what's in focus and out of focus. So if we select camera and go to its settings, we'll see this drop down box which we can choose our new empty, and we can increase the radius of the blur. Let's just make it 0.2, and that just means that everything that isn't on exactly the same plane as the camera looks at it is out of focus. Let's just move it up a little and move it back a little so that our focus starts a little further away from the camera, and we'll make that our first keyframe for the focus. We're going to change focus over time. So again, move a little further down the timeline. Let's change our focus over the animation to the front of the cubes, which is a nice small change of focus. That's fine. So we go down there and we set a keyframe for that by pressing I, location, and if we move through the timeline, we see that everything looks nice. So again, now we can head back to our environment settings and change the lighting if we want, just to something that looks nice with the whichever HDR file you're using. I can rotate around. You can see the lighting changing. So let's leave it rotated around its Z-axis by 90 degrees. And I'm actually just going to increase the light a little, so I'm going to change the strength to 1.2. And now if we head back to the render settings, we can change a few settings here. I do want it 1920 by 1080, 25 frames per second is fine. We need to choose a place to put the output files, so we click on our bookmark, make a new folder in there, call it Cubes Design Render. Click on that to go into it and just type a name for the files, call it Cubes Render, and accept. Now PNG is fine, RGB is okay. Let's change it to 16-bit, and I normally take the compression down to 0. Disk space isn't really that much of an issue these days. Now the seed we do want to animate over time, which just helps to get rid of static noise in a cycles render. So we move the timeline pointer to the start of the sequence and set a keyframe for the seed, just as 0. And then we can go to the end of the sequence and let's use 4000 again and just type 4000 and insert a keyframe there, and that will help as it renders to remove any noise. Now for my final render, I'm going to set the render samples to 1000, which will give a fairly clean render, particularly with the animated seed. And in the light path section, I'm just going to change it to full global illumination. It's maybe a little overkill. You can experiment with the settings yourself. And down in performance, I'm just going to change this to 256 by 256, which works well for my graphics card, which will work quite well with my graphics card. Now I'll change this from an image editor to full screen, which is fine. I'm just going to save that. Now I need to find a place within the animation, just by scrubbing on the timeline, where there are no cubes visible or shadows, so I'm going to say frame 30 is really where, just before the animation really starts to happen, and I'm going to change the start frame over in the render settings to frame 30. I can save that, and now we're ready to render, so simply hit animation. It's going to take a long time. It's probably going to take around 24 hours with the settings I've used. You don't have to use such high settings for samples, but in a production environment 24-hour renders are common, so I'm going to leave that to run. So that's the final result. I hope you like it. It took 29 hours to render eventually, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I'd just like to say thanks again to Seymour Money for creating the amazing script which made it possible, and see you next time. Bye.